Salam, Sheikh.
Salam, Salim.
Thank you very much for joining us again on the podcast. Third appearance now, and I feel like we've covered quite a lot of ground in the past, but there's always more that we can talk about, and we've always wanted to. And I think for context, how this kind of came about was the last time you were on, we were talking about changing your habits as a means to get closer to God and to find God. And we spoke about a variety of things. I think where we started from was the power of now. No, not the power of now. It was oh God, I can't remember the name of the book. You can't either. Oh, The Power of Habit.
The Power of Habit.
Yes, Charles Duggett or something like that. I can't remember his name.
So,
that's where we started.
yeah.
And then the conversation went on some winding route.
Incredible discussion. Mind-blowing, beautiful discussion.
If you haven't heard the podcast, do check it out. I'll put the link in the description. But what I said to you after that, actually, I sent you a voice note because I started listening to a book that you mentioned on that podcast, I believe. If not, then someone mentioned it to me afterwards, called... God, I'm really blanking on names right now.
The Surrender Experiment?
The Surrender Experiment by Michael A. Singer.
Yeah.
And what I said to you was, when I finish this book, it would be great to sit down and, like, anytime I do one of these, or I read one of these self-development, personal growth books,
Yeah.
it would be good to sit down with yourself, because I think you've covered a lot of, I don't know why you've read all of them, but you have, it seems.
Have a lot of time, have a lot of free time.
and to kind of have a conversation, and I guess start with the concepts and the notions within the book, and then use that as a leapfrog into just, let's see where it goes.
Yeah.
And ironically with this one, we'll talk about surrender at the beginning, but when I tried to sit down with you and discuss what we're going to talk about, you just gave me nothing and said, just surrender and we'll see where it goes. So I think let's start with the book and the notion of surrender. So firstly, I guess for people that haven't come across it, it's quite a fascinating book, I think, in terms of it's almost like an autobiography, but like a very introspective autobiography of Michael A. Singer, who is big on yoga and spirituality through that means. But he started out on the journey by kind of firstly appreciating the fact that the thoughts that run through his head and the narrative in his head are not necessarily him, and that's just a part of him that he can detach from and whatever else. And then he started learning how to silence his inner mind. And then the journey took him to kind of surrendering to whatever life was putting in front of him. Yeah. And it led him down a remarkable road. I mean, as the book went on, I was like, okay, this is getting a bit more and more far-fetched. Yeah. Until you get to the end. And I don't want to ruin his sort of story and his journey. Yeah. But it's quite crazy. Yeah. And I was thinking throughout, and I guess I'll start with this question. I was thinking throughout, whether it's just a coincidence that someone who has this kind of approach to life of surrendering went on to have a remarkable and almost crazy life in that sense, or if that's actually part of surrender.
Very good question. Is it despite of or because of? Yeah. Yeah. It's a very fascinating book, and it's been received really well. Of course, this wasn't his first book. He had the Untethered Soul, which is another amazing book, and I really recommend it to people who are going through anxiety or basically anyone who wants to have a better life. But this one was very interesting. He basically, as you said, mentions the story of his life and how this one simple practice of surrender basically changed the course of his life. And I think the way he puts it in the book, and we can discuss whether we agree or not, is that it was actually because of surrender that everything happened to him. And what was your personal take on it? Like when you were listening, could you relate to it or...
Our coffee machine has something to say, I think.
I love it. Your coffee machine, even last time we were doing a podcast, wanted to participate. And I really feel good. I'm like, if people don't want to listen to me, at least
you've got the coffee
machine. Yeah.
We'll wait for it to stop. I think it's hopefully done. So in terms of I guess when I'm reading these or listening to these books, I'm trying to see if I can resonate with the narrative. And with something like Surrender, I found for me that it was very Islamic in its outlook and in how it kind of presented itself.
Yeah.
In terms of like, if you replace the universe with God and surrendering to the will of God and embracing the opportunities that are put in front of you, I was reading it and assessing like me and opportunities that come my way and how I receive them. Because I think there is this notion, I believe, at least Islamically, that there are no coincidences. And, you know, conversations happen and things happen at a moment that's important and destined.
Yes.
And like one example from the book that really struck with me was, so he's a vegetarian. I'll briefly try and summarize this. He was in a different city and he was looking for food, and all he wanted was vegetables and rice. And so he's driving around, and he had got directions from the hotel. He couldn't find where he was going, and he got lost, and he ended up in some square. Then he drove around for another half an hour. He's starving at this point, and he's trying to get back to his hotel, and he ends up back in the same square. So he's like, okay, that's a sign from the universe. Maybe I'll find something. So he parks his car, he gets on foot, walks down a side alley, and he sees a restaurant, a vegetarian restaurant. He's like, oh my God. And then outside he sees a sign that says today's special, vegetables and rice. Now I know vegetarians don't have many options, so that's special for them. I had to take a dig at vegetarians, but so anyways, he's like, this is it. The universe has just like given me this. It's like amazing, and he felt like so fulfilled and whatever. And again, that's like enough of a lesson. It's like, you know, sometimes the universe is telling you things.
Yeah.
But then he gets into the restaurant, he eats his meal, and the owner of the restaurant is constantly like just looking at him really intensely. And then afterwards, when he goes to pay his bill, the guy is like, you're Mickey Singer, aren't you? And he's like, yes, I am. And he's like, you gave me a lift like 10 years ago, and you had a picture of your yogi master in the car, and you told me about his book. And then I went to a bookstore in my hometown and I read this book and it changed my life. And now I'm a devotee of this yogi. And he goes that he had tears in his eyes, and he's like, I've been waiting for the day that I can thank you personally. Yeah. And he comments in the book, he says that, you know, I thought the universe was like giving me food, exactly the food that I wanted, but actually it was fulfilling a much greater purpose for somebody else that I didn't even realize or know. Yeah. I think he got a free meal out of it as well. So it was a win-win in that sense. But for me, I think you can see those things, but you have to look for them. A lot of the times, like we kind of go through life very absently, where things happen, conversations take place. You know these like eureka moments or whatever, life-changing moments. Sometimes we don't realize they're life-changing until we retrospect. Yes. But the act of actively engaging with understanding everything that's happening to you, every thought that you're having, everything that's happening around you, I think that was a very powerful notion for me in the book. Yeah. But a big part of it, step one, which I haven't overcome at all, is quietening your mind. Yeah. And allowing yourself, because there's a lot of noise. Yeah. And especially I believe, at least in London, in the UK, like we live such fast-paced lives. And I think we might have discussed this previously as well. Yeah. But there's so much in the background that's going on that we don't even have a moment to process anything that's happening to us. Yeah. So that's like step one is that kind of, and all the meditation stuff as well. We have that in our tradition. Yeah. I think anyway, and I believe, and I've seen it, and it's always talked about like an hour of meditation is better than, I don't know, 1,000 months or years of ibadah, depending on where you've seen the hadith basically. But these notions exist. But I realized you asked me a question rather than me asking you one. What did you think about it personally? How did you relate to the book?
No, I really enjoyed your answer. And, you know, one of the things I think it's very important about surrender is that it shows that something like surrender, which could be very similar to, for example, tawakkul we have, or taslim or tafweed in our religion, it shows that this could actually be a lifestyle. Right? The problem we have with our own concept is that, yes, we've heard we should have tawakkul. No one tells us how. Just have tawakkul. And we've got a few hadiths like, you know, you do your own bit and leave the rest to God. But none of them have the power the way they are communicated to us currently, of course. Within them, they have so much power. But the way they are expressed to us, they don't have the power to form a lifestyle. And that's what I think made the Surrender Experiment such a powerful book, because it shows you that surrender is not something you do every now and then. It's a way of life, right? And it's basically, it's telling you that you can either make decisions, always think through your, through your thoughts, through what comes to your mind, try to plan a life for yourself, or there's another way of living in which you do your best, but you leave a lot of things in a very real sense to the universe or God. And he shows step by step, what does this process of letting go of control looks like when you want to choose a job, when you want to start a business. So it was really real. And I think this is what made the book so powerful, because you could immediately follow that. And I actually tried it a lot, right? So I give a lot of lectures, and especially when I listened to this book, it was pre-corona period, right? So going around many different cities giving lectures, and I would usually spend maybe days or weeks thinking about one lecture. And I would keep reading. And the problem when you keep reading for a lecture is that you never are done so that you can like summarize everything, right? Because till the last moment, I'm usually reading.
It's a rabbit hole, basically.
Yeah. So one day I was going, I think, to Birmingham. And I was like, for this lecture, I've read a lot, and this topic, I've spoken about it a billion times. Let me this time not focus too much on trying to get it perfect. Let me just see what comes to my mind in the moment. Let's go assess the situation. Let's basically surrender. And what happened was very fascinating. As soon as I sat, first of all, I didn't have all the pressure of I have to mention all these points in the lecture. And that immediately freed a lot of my mind to just be in the moment. Like look at the people who are there, talk to them, make conversations, because usually I'm like, oh, I have to say this, I have to say that, right? So initially the experience had changed just by me not focusing too much on trying to make it perfect the way I want it, right? Leaving some room for some other forces to make this perfect. And then through the lecture, I felt like ideas are coming to my mind, either from my previous studies years ago that I'd forgotten, or just right on the spot, that actually that became one of my best lectures, at least personally to myself. And I think this is very important. One of the philosophers has a line that you don't speak through language, language speaks through you, right? And I think this is very linked to this idea of surrender. This idea that if you don't always try to get things right, there are other forces or places from which ideas may come to you which may be better than the ones you're forcing on your life. Okay? Let me elaborate on this a little bit. In Islam, for example, we have, if you want to come up with an idea, experiment silence for a little bit, right? Don't talk too much if you were looking for ideas, right? Especially to scholars, this is like a spiritual instruction. And before, I always used to think, why do you want to silence me? I thought like I'm using my mind, I'm using my thoughts, my language to come up with ideas. Like that's all I do as a person whose job is to read. But so you're now telling me to silence myself? But then through my journey and also reading the works of some philosophers, I realized that there are two places from which ideas come, right? Or two modes of being in the world. And now, of course, this is even scientifically proven, right? We'll get into that maybe later on. The amazing book, The Master and His Emissary, by Ian McGilchrist, the Oxford psychologist. Amazing book. We'll get into that. But he there basically explains that there are two modes of being in the world. One mode, which is more controlled by the left hemisphere of our brain, tries to understand everything, control everything, right? Get a grasp of everything, right? The other side, the right hemisphere of the brain, the mode of existence in the world it has is that I don't want to grasp anything. I don't want to control things. I want to have a relation with them, right? And you can even see this in the way you are with people, right? For example, in some of the classes they would have for us when we wanted to become a therapist, they were like, when you're with a patient, there are two modes of being with a patient. Either prior to talking to them, you have this goal that, okay, I need to get them to change this belief about themselves, make them feel safer. And then throughout the whole interaction, the therapy session, all you're trying to do is to get them to go to that place you want them. This is more controlled by the left hemisphere. There's another mode of being with people in which you don't have a purpose, right? You're just trying to be there, be present, and communicate, right?
Is that more the empathy type?
That would lead to more empathy naturally, because you're not there from a place of control, right? And immediately you see that the other person understands this, right? So studies shows that we've got mechanism in our body that understands how you're attending me. Okay, now the same is with universe, the same is with everything. In whatever we do, we have these two modes of being. One tries to control, tries to grasp, right? Tries to understand fully, make it define. And another way in which it's more holistic, rooms for chaos. It allows room for chaos, tries to be in the moment. And a lot of the times when they tell us that be silent, ideas will come to you, they don't mean that you as a person be silent. They mean that you, the part of you that tries to understand everything, grasp everything, think of everything, allow that to take a break for a while. So the other way that you're in the world, your holistic relation with the world or with the person, that from that place ideas can come to you, right? So now you can see how surrender is very much related to this. So even if a person doesn't believe in a higher power, well, as Muslims we do, even if they don't believe, still they can appreciate this, because it means that by surrendering, it's not that you're letting go of making decisions, etc. No, you're just allowing the other mode of being in the world help you in making your decisions. How does that sound?
I think it makes sense. When you were saying that, I was thinking about, and again, I don't want to actually ruin the story of Michael Singer's life, but near the end, he has some very extreme circumstances that he finds himself in.
Yeah.
And what was incredible for me is that, obviously you do what you can. So he was going through, it was a legal situation. As I said, I don't want to ruin it, because it's actually, you wouldn't believe where he starts and where he ends up. But that ability, because you spoke about tawakkul earlier. And that trust. And we always talk about, just trust in God. And it's passively a very easy thing to say and a very easy thing to do. But the reality for me, I think, is that there's a certain level, and so Michael Singer in that moment, whilst is going through a very extreme situation that could end up in jail or whatever else, is able to kind of fight his corner, do what he needs to do, but then also be completely at ease with whatever transpires. And I think for me, like, a lot of it is about thinking of the control element, because I know when I find myself in a sticky situation, it's the control part of the brain, the left side, or I can't remember which side you said, that's in overdrive. And so when you talk about quietening your mind, for me it's like, okay, that anxiety and whatever's going to be there, but learn to not suppress that, but learn to control that, even to allow that space for accepting and engaging. Because I think, as you say, when and it's easy to say from a rational or like from a logical perspective, we believe in God. We believe, therefore, that whatever is happening to us, and we can get into conversations about predestination versus free will, but we believe that God is watching, God knows what's happening to us, and God doesn't burden us with more than we can handle. So easier said than done, but we need to be able to embrace the fact that everything is going to be okay. This is part of our journey. And I think that's probably the difficulty for me in all of this.
And this is why, I hope maybe today we can talk about this. I think this is why it's so important to know how to do things like tawakkul, like prayer. This is one thing which, unfortunately, right now, I think a lot of us are failing to understand. Tawakkul is a technology, right? It's a mode of being in the world. and you have to teach us how to do it. Otherwise, we won't do it. We would love to do it. We can't do it, right? So this is why I think it would be very good today maybe to speak about this, right? Because, you're saying that a lot of the times it's easier said than done. I don't think this is because it's a hard thing to do. I think this is because we haven't been taught it well, right? So imagine just this idea that you have to suppress your mind, right? If you're if you want to make a decision, and it also happens to a lot of creative people. They want to make a decision, no idea is coming, or they're suppress your mind, or let the... In fact, if we have better understanding of that, we'll know that you're not suppressing your mind, what you're doing. There are two parts to your mind. One of them wants to control, wants to understand everything, and it only works on the data it has. The other one allows new data to come in. It's more it's more of an explorer. So you're basically trying to give more room to the other part of your mind, right? So the more understanding we have, the more the dynamics of this becomes clear for us. And I think we wanted to say something, and then
No. Actually, sorry. Yeah. One thing I was going to say, I think, is that on this, I've always felt like the perception is that the other side of your mind, which you're identifying as an actual part of your mind, I've always thought and identified that as God-given inspiration. Do you know what I mean? It's don't shut your mind off, and God will inspire you with...
Exactly. I get you. Yeah, I get you.
But you're kind of making it a lot more tangible and saying that this is
So that's the thing. It's the same thing. There are different models of talking about it, right? But right now, with the current understanding we have in science, is that the two parts of your brain, or let's say the two types, the two modes of being you have in the universe, they're both you. But one of them cuts you from relationship with the universe and its creator, right? One of them brings you to your mind, makes you... It wants you to solve everything through the thoughts you already have, which is great. In its own place, it has to be there. But the other part of your brain, it allows you to have an open communication with God, with the universe. So ultimately, yes, the ideas are coming from God, but it's just that this part of your brain is the one open to receiving it, right? And I think this is, the more we know how this works, the easier it would be for us to do it. So we know that we're not actually suppressing our mind. We're allowing the part of our mind that can easier have connections with God to work now. And the same is with people, right? You can be with people and have your, preconceived notions of who they are, purpose of what I want to achieve in this meeting. And if you do that, you're not actually meeting that person, right? How many people have experienced this? That after a few years in a relationship, they feel like there's no excitement left, right? And the reason for that is not that these two people who are now in a relationship have suddenly turned into boring people. No. If they want to start a relationship with another person, again, they will experience the excitement. That person would be interested in them. So what happens? What happens is that after a while of being in a relationship, the mode of being, right, goes towards the left, the left hemisphere. And so you no longer meet the person when you're meeting them. You meet the ideas you have formed of them. Right? So after a few years of being with the person, if you're not careful, if you don't know how to be with them from a different mode, you're basically living with the image you have made of them in your mind. And that's why they say that usually, even when a partner changes, let's say I'm angry in a relationship, even if I fix my anger, they say it takes the couple a year or 2 years, the other partner, to realize my partner has changed. Because they're not living with me. They're living with their mental representation of me, right? So this is with even people, this is with God, this is with the universe, this is with everything. So we can either, even with God, it's the same thing. We can either keep living with the ideas we have made of God in our mind, or try to contact that divine being fresh, right? So there's basically this idea, there's two modes of being in the world. In one, you have a fresh encounter with something, with God, with your partner, with yourself, or you have an encounter which is not a presentation of that thing, it's a representation. Your mind has already formed it, right? So this is why we get bored with our with our parent, with our partners, with God, with so many things, with ourselves, right? So this is, I think, something that we can maybe explore a little bit.
So it's very interesting. I'm thinking about, I want to come back to tawakkul. You mentioned,
Sure.
Maybe that's something we can explore. And I think where I wanted to kind of steer the conversation slightly as well, and maybe we can start with this and then focus on tawakkul afterwards.
Yeah.
But I've seen and read, I don't want to say a lot, but I've read a few books. Like I've mentioned a couple of them. So Surrender Experiment, The Power of Habit. Prior to that, The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. Quite an old book. Robin Sharma, I think, wrote that. And then Paulo Coelho has a bunch of books that I know have, had millions of people read them and engage with them and really change their perspective. But what I wanted to ask is from an Islamic perspective, we don't seem to have authors or works and books that have had that kind of mainstream appeal. But whenever I've read books that talk about spirituality, like all of the books that I've just mentioned, and obviously many more, I always see so many elements of Islamic spirituality within them.
Exactly.
But why do you think Islamic spirituality as a sort of notion is not working?
Yeah.
Do you think it's not working?
Well, yes, and I think so because of what I've been told by people. I was actually having a discussion just last week with a friend of mine, and he said, you know what, I love Islamic spirituality. I really want to get that feeling of change, of spiritual growth in my life through it, but it's not working. I'm reading the books, I'm listening to the lectures, but it doesn't work. Whereas I've been reading, for example, The Untethered Soul, The Surrender Experiment, the works, and it's changing my life. And being the typical Muslim, he said, I even feel guilty about it. Why am I feeling spiritual with these books, right? Yeah. So I think the problem we have is not, as you said, it's not that we don't have these things. In fact, any of them that we read, once we understand them, we're like, oh my God, similar. The issue I think we have is that at some point, it seems like our mainstream way of talking about Islam forgot this idea that you just transferring knowledge through words doesn't do the job, okay? Let me give an example of prayer, okay? We actually have a hadith from the Prophet that a lot of fuqaha use, in which the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, look at me the way I pray and pray in the same way, okay? Look at the way I pray and then pray the same way. Now, how did we understand this, right? We were like, okay, so the Prophet got up, his hands were in that position, and then he went down, and then he did this, and then he did that. And then we kept transferring this, right? And then he said prayer has certain qualities, and we memorized that. Yes, like for example, it stops you from doing bad, it makes you a better person, it stops you from being angry, etc. All of that, okay, we transferred all of. But then it doesn't have any of those impacts on us. Honestly, how many Muslims are there who, as a result of their prayer, have, in a significantly become better people, right? And I know a lot of people actually have stopped their salah, not much change to them. Yes, they do feel a little bit of missing it, but it's not like they've suddenly become that much nicer or that much more patient. Why? See, we have forgotten this, that these are technologies that you have to learn. Let's go to the example. Prophet said, look at me the way I pray and pray the same way. What did we hear? Okay, what time was it? How was he bending? Now, if, for example, you've got here the amazing creative person, right? He's sitting behind the computer. He's sitting behind the screen. And now imagine if I want to learn how to be creative like him. Okay, I want to become an artist, a graphic designer. And he tells me, look at me if you want, maybe you can learn to be creative. And I'm like, okay, what is he doing? He's sitting behind a computer. Okay, I need a computer. And then every half an hour, he turns around, talks to Salim, and then he comes, okay, so for creativity, every half an hour. So do you think just by looking at what's happening outside, like the way he's sitting, if I just imitate that, I will become a creative person. Whereas with prayer, we're doing exactly the same thing, right? We're only focusing on what he was doing outside the Prophet. And we've forgotten completely about all the things which should happen inside the person, okay? Where was his attention when he was saying Surah Al-Fatiha? Do you pay attention to the meanings of the words? Do you talk to God? What do you do? You know, all of these things that happen inside, we don't pay attention to them. And no one gets up to say, I mean, a lot of people do actually, but as a whole, we don't stop and think, well, hang on a minute. I'm praying, it doesn't have the impact on me. Can someone teach this to me? I know the ahkam, but this is not prayer. Can someone really teach the actual prayer to me? You know, Karen Armstrong has a book called The Lost Art of Scripture. There, she talks about this idea that you cannot transfer religion through books or through words. It's a technology that has to be taught to you in a very real sense, right? So exactly like what I was saying from creativity, right? We're seeing this person is sitting there, has got this like iMac in front of him, clicking on a mouse, but that doesn't make us creative. We need an actual, real, creative person telling us about the inner process of being creative, right? So we've lost that with prayer. No one is talking about that. I mean, there are people, again, as I'm saying, but as a whole, the same is with tawakkul, right? Does this make sense?
It does make sense. I think, and I've the lines between the podcast and reality for me, this is reality, but you know, the lines between podcast and non-podcast conversations I've had are blurred. In that, I can't remember the amount of times I've had conversations about form versus essence. I think that's what we're discussing here. So I remember, and I may have reflected on this on the podcast, I apologize if people have heard this before, but when we went for Hajj, there's a lot of rules. There's a lot of, you know, technicalities. You have to do this. You have to wear this here. You have to throw, the stones at the pillars. It has to be. And I feel like whilst the form is important, without the essence, it's nothing.
It's absolutely nothing.
And so Hajj was an interesting one, and maybe we're getting on a tangent here, but let's go down the rabbit hole, see what happens. But for me, Hajj was one of the most ritualistic things I've seen in Islam, because I've always seen Islam to be very there are certain things we have to do, but a lot of it is very kind of relationship based between yourself and God. But Hajj was like, okay, cool, we have a relationship, but walk around this 7 times and then pray here and then run between these 2 things. And it's so prescriptive. But I was constantly trying to understand what's beneath this. And it's difficult, especially with something like Hajj. It's not something that you prepare for on an ongoing basis. So right now, if you're not planning to go for Hajj, you're not thinking about tawaf and sa'i and all these things. But then suddenly you book your trip and you got a few weeks to like suddenly understand the essence of all of this stuff. But I think, like, you know, when I was out there, I was really trying to kind of connect with the essence of what's going on, rather than just making sure I've ticked all the boxes. Because ticking the boxes, and it's like, you know, the fantastic example you're giving about creativity there, where I've always struggled to understand how you can transfer this. Because even, I mean, if we continue the metaphor of creativity, so fine, you know, by buying the computer, by sitting in a certain way, by drinking the coffee, by having the conversations every half an hour, all of that stuff, that's not going to make you creative. How does that transference take place? And also, you know, is it then a like for like? Because even I think with things like creativity, I don't consider myself to be a creative person. I'm surrounded by creatives, videographers, editors, graphic designers. I just sit there and kind of have conversations on a podcast, which is a lot of fun. But that essence of creativity, I've learnt on the peripheral side of things, like bits here and there. I know what to look out for, but I don't have that kind of creative spirit at heart. Do you know what I mean? So if we carry that forward then to thinking about prayer, or I mean, let's focus on prayer. But it's one thing to know the elements. So I know we need to look at the Prophet's essence. When it comes to this, but how?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we will talk about that. Actually, I have a few examples that will be interesting to talk about. But I think, you know, you mentioned quite correctly that we do talk about this, the form and essence, etc. But I think at the moment we are in right now in the history, us as Muslims have to make this our top priority or one of our top priorities. It shouldn't be one of the things we talk about. It should be one of our top priority things that we have to figure out. Otherwise, a lot of people are leaving the religion every day, right? And I'm not saying like that's for me to say leave or not leave. Like, that's their decision. For me, the sad thing is if there was something here that could have helped them, which I believe there is, and they left it without benefiting from it, right? So it's a very serious thing, and I believe we have to turn this into our priority, right? So they say for any kind of transforming, for any kind of change, you have to have a diagnosis, a vision of where you want to go, and then get at it, right? I don't see that many people, trying to solve this problem. And of course there are, and actually, because you were mentioning books, I just want to mention this amazing books by an author called A. Helwa. I'm not sure if that's her real name or not, but on the book it says A. Helwa, and it's an incredible book. Just search her on Amazon Books or any other. How do you spell her surname, do you know? Sorry?
How do you spell
Helwa. Okay. Incredible book about spirituality. So definitely get that. So we have some Muslims who have written amazing books on spirituality, and it has a mainstream appeal. So perfect. Just wanted to shout out that. But yeah, but as a whole, you don't see this thirst for trying to solve this problem, right? The same is with our hadith. The same is with Quran. Like a lot of the times I see people when they want to start, this is now. People who may even complain themselves of, religion doesn't really change me. But then when they start a page on Instagram, they want to share Islamic things, they just post a hadith, right? Okay, the Prophet said, anger does this. Or we have a hadith that, don't break your promises to your child. I'm like, this doesn't cut it anymore. Right? You complain yourself, but then you come and post the hadith without any further exploration. How is this hadith going to change anyone? Don't we know that you shouldn't break your promises to your child or you shouldn't be angry? These hadiths were there to open the room for exploration, so you bring out the deep content in there. And I want to give an example as well, so that they don't think this is just an abstract idea. See, this very hadith that don't break your promises to your child, young child, because to them you are the Rab, right? So to them you are the Lord. So although Lord is not a good translation for Rab, but whatever. And okay, let's see how much can we explore in this. And in order to explore in this, we can't just rely on Islamic books. You have to know the current science. You have to know psychology. You have to know so many things. This is another thing which I think we really need to do. See, one of the mistakes we make, I'm just trying to elaborate on this hadith and see how much wisdom there was, which we're not benefiting from. One of the mistakes we make is that we think you can transfer beliefs through words, through classes, through Sunday schools, right? Religious parents committed to transferring their religion to their children, a good Muslim upbringing. So they're like, okay, let's send them to the Sunday school. Let's send them to madrasa, where they'll bombard them with information that God is nice, God is this, God do this, God is that. And then some of them will keep that. A lot of the people won't keep that in a real sense. And I want to talk about the difference between having a belief in your mind and having it as an actual belief that counts, okay? So I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent to be able to explain this, but just to understand where we are, I'm explaining the hadith by the Prophet that don't break your promises to your child. And I'm going to explain why this is such a deep hadith that could have changed the life of so many children if we had just understood what it meant. Now, see, in therapy sessions, a lot of the people that come for therapy have anxiety issues, right? And we have this technique of where you're trying to, the person, right? The person who's come for the therapy, they try to discover themselves what is the root cause of their therapy, right? So it's a way of, we teach them how to talk to themselves to bring the reason out. For example, a person who may be experiencing a lot of anxiety in a discussion with themselves, they realize, okay, you know why I'm so anxious? Because everything for me has to be perfect. I have this expectation of myself that all my work has to be perfect. Then they ask themselves, why am I like this? And then they realize, oh my God, you know what? And of course, this takes time and it's a method. It's not as easy as this, right? So they may come to realize that, oh, you know what? As a child, I felt like the love of my parents depended on my performance, right? So my parents would only show me love when I was performing really well. So this belief was formed in me that love is dependent on you being perfect. And then my expectations of myself went off the roof because I want to be loved. It's a human need, and anxiety. See how it happened? That's the chain. Now, this is the belief that this person formed about the universe, that in order to be loved, you have to be perfect, right? I don't care how many Sunday schools told this person that God loves you as a human being, you have a soul. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. None of that means anything. Even if this person teaches them to others, the core belief this person has is that no, a human soul is not لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا. A human soul needs to be perfect in order to be loved, right? So you don't teach these beliefs to your child through those classes. It's the action you did. Now, why is it so important not to break your promise to your child? Because when your child is 2-3 years old, you are channeling God for them. They don't have a concept of this world has a creator. They look at you and you are the Rab. It's in the hadith by the Prophet. So however you treat them, that would be the belief they form in their heart. This is not explicit. This is not in their mind. This is in their heart, right? This is implicit memory of their body. That yes, Dad broke promise to me, so universe, its creator are not reliable, right? Now the child may get 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, teenager, send them to Sunday school. They'll tell them, yes, God is adil, God is just, God is reliable. But this person will live based on the idea that the universe is not reliable. And imagine how much anxiety is going to be caused by believing that this universe has a creator who breaks his promises, right? No matter how much work this person does intellectually, they can't get rid of that belief which was formed. Now see how deep this hadith is. Don't break your promises to your child, right? Instead of all that religious teachings, just do one thing. Don't break your promises. So in order to get benefits from prophets and from hadiths, we need to open them up, you know? And in this way, then we'll see, oh my God, this is such a deep and life-changing tradition, right?
So that's really insightful and fascinating, specifically because I've been thinking, because my wife is kind of studying this therapy kind of stuff, and we have conversations about it. And one of the conclusions that she's kind of drawn, and I've drawn at least personally, is that early childhood trauma, and trauma doesn't have to be anything extreme, but it can be something like you've just described, can and does actually have a huge impact on people's lives and the way that they shape everything that they do. And I've seen that and I've believed that, and you can kind of do your pseudo psychoanalysis on people, at least my own, like I don't know anything about this space, but I'm like, okay, XYZ in early childhood has manifested in this today. And I've always kind of had said, all right, so psychology has kind of clocked that very well. And I've never drawn that link to a hadith of the Prophet like that. And I think that's hugely profound because, as you say, like, you look at these hadith, which are very simple. Don't get angry. Be nice to your kids. Don't break promises, whatever. But as you say, if we're able to unlock the level of depth, and I think, at the same time, I'd probably put it back on you and say that it's the role and responsibility, I think, of our learned members of the community, of our sheikhs, of our students, who have that dual perspective, who have that duality of knowing, for example, modern science. Like you've spoken quite a lot about science today, and also understand Islamic tradition and whatever else to help us as a community make those links. Because I think, and this is another thing, right at the beginning when you were talking about a hadith and people posting them on Instagram and whatever else, and you're 100% right. And in fact, we've had stuff on where a lot of people and a lot of pages that are set up as like those reminder pages, and Hussein Kesvani, who's been on our podcast previously, in his book Follow Me Aki, within that, he interviews one guy who is who has one of these pages with, you know, thousands of followers, and basically the page was an aspirational page. So all of the values that he was talking about were things that he wanted to aspire towards, not where he was at. It was like a reminder for himself and for everybody else. And it got me thinking that I think one issue that we have is that lay people, because of our kind of very weak and flailing connection with the religion and spirituality, we're culturally Muslim, and that's been spoken to, I think, at length. But it's almost like, oh, the Prophet said this, therefore let's do it. No deeper thought goes into it. So you know this kind of checkbox mentality. It's like, I have to do X, Y, Z to be a good Muslim. To be a good Muslim, the Prophet said I have to pray, I have to fast, I have to whatever. God has said this in the Quran. And it's like, oh, there's a hadith that says pay your taxes, for example, therefore let me pay my taxes. And there's that very robotic approach to things. Do you know what I mean?
So the problem with this is what? The problem with this is that at some point, all the teachings of Prophet just go away, and you are left with basically, I mean, what you end up doing in your life all become what your mufti tells you. And these are not even when he gives ethical advices. All that is left of Islam becomes the apparent acts, right? Because those are the ones which are easy to do. Bend, go up, go to sajda, do all of this, right? And we miss out on all the important things. Now, if we just want to do this, because what happens is that these hadiths, if you just listen to them like this and transfer it to your children, right? Like there are many parents who may even say, you know what, learn the Quran, learn these hadiths, memorize these hadiths. What we don't realize that these are 100%, or let's be careful, 99% useless. If you don't elaborate on them, there's no point. Just a few weeks ago, I gave a small talk on this hadith by the Prophet that says people could pray and their prayer would only get them farther from God, right? Because if you don't realize that prayer is a technology, sajda is a technology, it has to create a change inside you. So if you just do it, the Prophet says sometimes that's even worse, because what happens is that you get this idea that, well, I even tried prayer, it didn't really change myself that much. And usually the parents' generation may be even guilty to say that, but their children see that. You have no idea how many messages I'm getting from parents saying my children are telling me, why should I pray? It's not changing you, it's boring, right? And they may force them, but I'm sure 10 years, 20 years after, they'll realize. Right? So this is the problem. When you don't realize that these technologies have to be open, you don't get change. And the Prophet says this is worse, because you're passing this information on to your children that, yeah, prayer, we tried it, not much change there. Whereas if they were with parents who hadn't prayed, maybe the possibility that prayer could be a beautiful thing would have been in their mind. Okay? And so this is, I think, the main problem we have. Right? We are transferring hadiths, which, of course, it's a beautiful thing. Bless the generations who pass it on to us, because we needed them to be able to open them up. But now it's the time, it's a serious, urgent priority for us now to keep opening them. Right? We need to keep opening them. Otherwise, let me tell you this. I believe the impact of religion, Islam we're talking about right now, on our mental health, on our well-being in this world, on our spirituality is very minimal. Very minimal. You remember I gave the example of we have a Ferrari we're going 5 miles per hour with in the previous podcast? This is it, and this breaks my heart, right? And we think this is Islam. What we're doing right now is not Islam. Not even by any stretch of imagination. Okay? So we need to start taking this seriously, making it into a priority. And yes, you're right. A person who's not a scholar, who hasn't studied it, may not have the knowledge to do that, but they can have the expectation, right? They can have the expectation. When you see something's not changing you, why do you go and ask for more? Why do you then even force that on your children, right? It's very interesting. One of the spiritual teachers was mentioning this thing. He said, a lot of parents come to me and say, why don't my child follow the way, we did all of the things, religion, why isn't my child not following me? And I said, look at yourself. Where are you right now? Do you want your child to be like you? You're miserable, you're stressed, you don't have any presence of God in your life. Why do you want your child to be like you? So, yes, I'm a layperson. I don't have the Islamic understanding. Can I have at least the expectation, the understanding that this is not going well? And then not forcing my child when he or she comes up with a good question? See, when your child comes to you and say, this prayer is not working for me, that's a great opportunity for you to understand probably wasn't working for you either. Because if it was, you had an answer to give them. And then you go to the sheikh. You're like, Sheikhna, or to the mufti or whoever's giving lecture. We want more. Make it more elaborate. If this one not, then another one, another one, another one, another one, right? People have to know that this is not working. One of my teachers was giving this example that if you go to a doctor and he gives you a prescription, so you've got terrible headache, get these 2 pills, it's going to go away in 2 hours. You go home, you take the pills, it doesn't work, right? Your headache is getting worse. What would you do? Probably you would either go to the doctor and say, didn't work, terrible pills, or you would go to another doctor. But when it comes to religion, they say, pray, your anxiety will go away. It doesn't work. I'm like, oh, maybe I don't have anxiety.
You know what I think that is actually? I think a lot of that is kind of keeping up with the Joneses. So you're told, do X and Y will happen. And everybody else on the surface seems to have had that impact, have had that reaction. So you think, oh, well, clearly the problem is not with the prescription, the problem is with me. Like I'm not working, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't work in a medical sense, but it's like, oh, there's something wrong with me. Yeah. That's why. So I just need to do this harder. I need to pray harder. I need to fast harder. And it will eventually work. But I think it's bold, I guess, for you to present the perspective that actually we should push back and demand more and demand alternatives.
Exactly.
But I at the same time, I feel like, and again, this is probably a different tangent that we can take maybe even another time, but I don't feel like a lot of our, because you're right, when it comes to mental health, I think it's a huge area that needs to be discussed and explored, and something that we've tried to do on the Muslim Vibe quite a lot. But when you correlate that with lectures and seminars and workshops that are given in our Islamic centers and establishments, obviously pre-COVID, a lot of the content is a lot more fiqh and akhlaq based, for example. Don't necessarily look at mental health. Now you'll see like titles like Islam and mental health as like a topic.
It's become just marketing.
Very surface level. That kind of thing. But I don't know if our institutions are fully ready and set up to provide this faculty for us.
I get you. Okay. Great point. Let me say one thing as well, that not all the fault is on the scholars as well.
It's all with them. I'm blaming the scholars.
What happened, and I learned this through like my own lived experience, that a lot of the times the kind of scholars that could help us with these kind of issues are the exact scholars who are not supported by the community, right? See, a scholar who can help us with these kind of answers has to do a lot of work. The amount of knowledge required to understand one hadith in a way that would actually make sense, not a cliche we say and everyone's like, oh, Prophet said. The amount of work is immense. And unfortunately, it's these very kind of scholars who are not supported by the traditional systems of supporting a scholar that we have in the community. So this one's not on the scholars. You know how many great friends I had who I had so much hope in, like I was willing to sell my car to support them, right? But the problem with my car wouldn't be enough for them. Exactly. But now, because there's no support, they've had to be doing other things. So the kind of scholars the community needs the most are usually the kind of scholars that they don't support. So that's one thing. And secondly, yes, it's not like in one day we're going to discover all the answers. We're going to have the best tafsir of the Quran, or we're going to realize, oh, how the Prophet was exactly praying. But if we're honest, if we come together, then each person can provide one part of the answer and we can get closer, right? Some of the discussions I've had with teenagers, especially teenage girls, they are super insightful. You know, and one of the things I like about this generation, this is a no BS generation. You know, they're amazing. We may find them really difficult, but that's on us. They're amazing, especially when it comes to religion. If you tell them do this, they do it and it doesn't work, they'll come and say it to your face, right? And I love this because I'm interested in these kind of discussions. So I'm like, perfect, yes, tell me why it doesn't work. And it says, you know what, I tried to do this way. I couldn't feel like I'm talking to God. I was like, okay, what ideas did you come up with? And she may say, you know what, I actually tried this. How about I try this? They have amazing discussions, amazing ideas, right? So it doesn't also, all the answers doesn't have to come from the scholars. If we just be honest that the current way is not working, ideally, then altogether we can slowly come up with the answers, right? Sometimes maybe our children can teach amazing things to us. Honestly, the amount of insights I've got from teenagers is incredible, of how they had to change their prayer to make it work for themselves because they don't want to do something that doesn't work. Okay, so this is also something that we should be optimistic about.
So on that first point that you mentioned, I think it's a very important point actually, that there is fault and blame definitely on the side of the scholars, which I think, you know, we can both agree on. But you're also right that communities are at fault for, and like you said, you know, the expectation. And what I've seen, at least, you know, being involved in my local mosque, for example, as well as one particular example, but generally speaking, when it comes to how we pick our imams or how we pick the speakers and things like that, I constantly feel like the criteria is failing the community. And again, this isn't a specific example with my mosque, but generally what I've seen is that a lot of the times conversations I had around like, oh, what kind of a crowd are we going to bring in? How can we maximize seats, you know, people bums on floor basically. Who's going to bring the crowd? And unfortunately, it's not about what's the best in terms of development for the community. And even like I feel like at a mosque leadership level generally, conversations are often geared towards things that are less inclined towards education. So for me, I think the central and the focal point of an Islamic establishment, institution, mosque, madrasa, whatever, has to be education.
Absolutely.
It has to be, what journey are we taking the community on? Which direction do we want to go in? And how can we find scholars that supplement that? Now, okay, there's arguments being made that scholars should be a part of the leadership structure to be making those decisions, which I think is important. But if it's going to be run by members of the community and whatever else who are elected representatives or otherwise, I still feel like the focal point should be education.
Exactly.
It should be having a curriculum almost for how are we taking this community forward. Instead, unfortunately, it comes down to kind of people politics. What food are we going to eat? Is the property big enough? Do we need to buy a new plot and everything else? And that's where that becomes the focal point of even conversations amongst community members.
Now, I totally agree with that. And at the same time, I can understand why the managers of a mosque or a center would behave that way. And maybe because, you know, at the end of the day, we're all in the same team, right? So if any of them is listening and I want to talk to them, is that it's in everyone's benefit for us to take these things seriously, right? Because your daughter, your son will come to the center that now you are managing this way. And if you are not accommodating for discussions that can help them with their mental health, with their belief about God, you will suffer yourself, right? And this doesn't hit people unless it gets personal, right? Unless they see that one day for example, their child or a nephew or a niece is going through a serious, let's say, anxiety disorder, can't get up, doesn't have any purpose, right? Has phobias, or in another cases has left Islam. See? So understand that this can happen to yourself. And we're all in one community. And believe me, one of the things that really gets me passionate about these things, the discussions I'm having with real people and the difficulties they're going through. Parents who don't know how to deal with their teenagers, right? Like serious issues. or even younger kids. So however way you design that mosque, your children will be there, you know? And it could be the difference between a person who is going through a lot of difficulties, cannot receive help, doesn't find connection to God, or a young, you know, active person with purpose who wants to do, you know, all of this depends on how you set that setting environment. And also, I want to move back to our discussions because I'm like, I want to give more examples of how we can elaborate and make use of religion, right? But just last point I want to say on this topic is that even sometimes when we get a scholar for a center, we burden them with so much task as if this person doesn't need to grow, right? There is no scholar who's done with their studies, right? If you want good answers, this person needs to grow to provide better answers with you. But I was looking at the expectation sometimes communities have, they even have contracts with their scholars. The amount of work that I'm like, where does this guy have time to think, to come up with new ideas, to find a better way to make your child feel better, right? None. So I just wanted to put that out there because that really broke my heart. When I saw these contracts sometimes they sign with the scholars, I'm like, this is torture, right? You have to understand this person needs to grow because your life depends on this, right? Okay, let's change the topic. We
can get back on track. That's
less
fine.
grim rants. I want to mention another hadith because, again, I feel like we're doing a lot of injustice to the Prophet. And recently, I don't want to talk about the political things that have been happening, a lot of incidents about the Prophet, etc., etc. But I want to be bold at the risk of getting some heat and saying we as Muslims are doing more injustice to the Prophet than any non-Muslim, right? And how so? By not taking him seriously. See, if you want to, for example, if you have a gym instructor, what would taking him seriously be? Putting photos of him in your house? Keep like having sessions and say, oh, gym instructor, oh, my gym instructor, oh, my gym instructor. Or following his plan, changing your life so that others will look at you and say, oh my God, this gym instructor is amazing. Usually this is how a lot of people find their gym instructors or trainers. Oh my God, you've got a nice body now, right? Who? This person. Imagine if we were a community so beautiful in akhlaq, in our spirituality, in our psychology, right? And then we're like, wow, which prescription did you follow? Oh, that's of this guy called Muhammad, peace be upon him. Would anyone then go and care? Oh, no, you know, he was like this. He was like, no, oh my God, give me this prescription. I need it, right? The best way to get rid of all the hate is to make people feel like they need him. And honestly, I don't really think we're doing that right now. I don't think our life shows anyone that we've got a good gym trainer or spiritual trainer, being the Prophet, right? And I think this is the worst disservice to him. And so on the same spirit, let's open one of his teachings and then see how much, for example, do you agree?
Yeah.
So we already mentioned one hadith by the Prophet and how if you just transfer that, that's disservice. If you don't expect it to change your life, that's not respect, right? It's not respect to an idea to put it on your head or to have imagine if someone wants to respect, for example, me as a thinker, as a very humble, stupid person, right? In no way compared to the Prophet, but even with me, if someone wants to respect me, I wouldn't want them to frame my quotes and put it on the wall, right? Respecting me would be that if I say something doesn't make sense to you, come and tell me. That's taking me seriously. If you want to take Quran, which is the best gift that God gave to us through the Prophet, seriously, it's not by saying, oh, Quran. It's taking it seriously. It's acting upon it. Otherwise, you keep saying this is going to change life, but it doesn't do anything. So, take things seriously. And one way of showing respect is if it doesn't make sense, then go and say that. Saying this doesn't make sense to me is not disrespect to the Prophet or to God or to the Quran. It's the best respect you can give, right? If I'm giving, for example, this podcast, we're having a discussion, and I say something you don't agree with, if you don't tell me, that is disrespect, right? Because I can't then defend myself, I can't explain more. So that was another thing I wanted, another rant. Okay, that rant out of the way. Prophet has a hadith, which again, we have this later on from many sources, this has come down to us, this teaching. That if you've got a child for the first 7 years, treat them as like a kind of king, right? Let them have their way. The next 7 years, like a kind of, what is it called? Not that everything they say. No. You treat them like what is it called? Like someone that you talk to, you know? Like it's not that they're the king, but they're someone that you get advice from, you talk to, you know? So same level. And then in the next 7 years, a different teaching is given, right? So the first 7 years, treat them as a king. Whatever they say, yes, that's it. Let them have their way. After that, the next 7 years, you talk to them. Okay, you want to do this. Why? What is your reasoning? Not that you force your own ideas on them. No. You start talking to them. Okay, so you want to do this. What are your thinkings? And you would be surprised of how really the children have amazing arguments, etc. Now, this hadith has been mentioned a billion times, at least I've heard it. But again, we didn't go deeper in this. First of all, why 7? Is there a particular reason? Does anything happen to the child at the age of 7? Right? Why is it divided to 7 years? Okay? Okay, treat them as a king. What does that mean? How do you make the shift in the 7 years from going from the king to a kind of vizier how do you make this shift, right? There are so many questions about this hadith that we never asked. And now, I was just last month reading this amazing book by a psychologist from Chicago. God, this guy, the insights he has is incredible. There, without, by the way, any knowledge that there is such a hadith, right? He's just explaining about this idea of how when a child is born, they have a kind of inner grandiosity, okay? They genuinely believe they're the center of the world, they're the king, all of that. And they even test sometimes to make sure if you believe in the same thing or not. So for example, he says you may be at the dinner table and there's food in front of the child, but he sees there's a food on the other side of the table. For no better other reason than just testing to see if you believe they're the king or not. Say, I want that one, right? I want that one from all the way on the other side. Just to see if you also give them the confirmation that they're the king. Now, he's saying that this inner grandiosity, the way you deal with this can be the root of almost all of the psychological issues that the child may have later on. Okay? It's very interesting. He actually does a very beautiful study. He goes through the DSM, this book that has the name of all the different mental disorders, right? It's a very, like, the Bible of psychology. He goes through every single one of these and he shows how most of them go back to parents not dealing well with this inner grandiosity. And then he explains, how do you deal with this? Now, there may be some parents who may be interested in this, right? So he says, yes, definitely, this needs to be taken very seriously. You have to actually treat your child as he is, with the smaller g, the God of the universe. That's how he feels or she feels. You treat them like that. And in order to do this, the child needs to be with two parents who understand this, because this requires a lot of patience, right? And we hear this and we're like, okay, I want to do this, but then we go with our life, we go back to the same pattern. If you're a religious person, you want your child to have a religious life, like I'm talking to you personally, dear listener, and you care about your child, I want you to make this decision in your mind right now, because I know you care a lot about, you put a lot of effort into making your child a good child, right? You drive them every Sunday to the school or to Sunday school. You buy CDs for them. You talk to them. You care, and you're putting a lot of effort. Now I want you to know that the most important effort, make this decision right now. All the difficulty you go through that way, bring that effort into this, just being patient with them, letting them have their way, because they need to have this. And most people don't, right? Most people were not treated as kings in the first years of life. And then what happens if you don't treat your child like that? This inner grandiosity, this I am greatness, right, goes out of their ego and goes to their unconscious part. Okay? So they're going to have self-esteem issue because all the source of greatness they felt about themselves is gone. Is no longer in their ego. Is no longer in their personality. So it's in their unconscious. But not only they're going to have self-esteem issues, but from that unconscious, they're going to be all the time on the attacked by that. So all these perfectionist thoughts will come from their unconscious part of the mind to their mind. You're not perfect. Why? Because their unconscious is so great, all the greatness went there. So they're going to keep receiving, you're not great. And how many of us, even adults, we go through that. No matter how much successful we are, there's a voice in our head that always tells us, no, you're not great enough. You didn't do best. You know, sometimes the best thing happens in our life, and at night we want to, no, I wasn't good enough, right? Most actors, most athletes, scholars, everyone goes through. Why? The greatness has went into the unconscious, that's now attacking you.
So if I can jump in here and have like quite a practical, because as a parent with a 2-year-old, I'm trying to assess how we deal with our daughter. So funnily enough, last night she refused to sleep till about 10:30 p.m. But you're constantly from like 7:30 trying to make your daughter sleep, and giving in the way that you're kind of saying is I think at least on one level going to be harmful for the child on a physical level, right? Like they don't get enough sleep. So you're trying to make them sleep, but then they're not in control because they don't want to sleep and blah, blah, blah. That's, I think, what the first response would be to what you've just said from a parent. Because that's what I'm thinking. Like, I'm not just going to let my daughter stay up all night because she's the king of the universe.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so that's the thing. See, in order to be able to bring our parents up like this, we need a whole great community with understanding. Right? A lot, and so the burden of living this way is not only on parents. There needs to be supportive, systems in place. And I'll explain this. So many of us don't even have the time to be there for our children to let them be the kings. Right? We have to work so hard to pay for the rent that we don't even have the time. So I'm not saying all the burden is on the parents. Right? In order for a lot of these spiritual teaching or psychology to work, you need a whole society to build differently or design in a different way. But there are things we can do. And one of the, actually, you mentioned a good example of sleep. Let me mention about eating, because this is an area I've had a lot of research in. A lot of the things we as parents do to help our child actually creates all sorts of problems with them. Most of the people, including myself, I'm not saying like I'm not, having a go at people who are overweight. I've been overweight most of my life until I'm like slowly discovering to deal with this. So there is hope, by the way, for all the listeners who've tried 25 different diets. The reason why diets don't work, which now all the scientific studies are showing us, right? Almost all of the diets don't work. You will lose weight, in 2 years' time will come back. The reason for that is that we have lost touch with our body, right? Oh my God, actually, this is great to mention a hadith. Perfect, thank you. Why have we lost touch with our bodies? Because when we were children, we told our parents, we're not hungry. They were, no, we have to eat. I have seen this in every family gathering I go to. The child says, I don't want to eat. The parent says, no, you have to eat. What do we do when we force our child to eat? We teach them, don't listen to the message of your body that says, right now, I don't need food. Why? Because we think we know better. Okay? And then as a result of this, most of us as adults, we don't know when we are full. Right? So, have you heard that hadith in Islam we have that stop eating before you are full, before you are completely full? Do you know that most of us cannot act according to this hadith? Why? Because we are not connected to our body enough to know when we are full. Why? because we have gone against the message of our body for so long that we have literally lost connection with our body. Try this, right? The dear listeners. When you're eating, try to see when you will be full. You'll realize that, and you'll be like, how do they even know that? Is there part, like, how would you know that? Which part of your body tells you that? See, this is how detached we are with our body. And the interesting thing is this, there are ways to start connecting to your body. It takes a few months, but you can learn to listen to that message. And the interesting thing is, once you do that, you wouldn't even need a diet. You would naturally get to the perfect weight for your body. So we didn't need any diet, right? Through just intuitive eating. And who destroyed this for us? Loving parents, loving aunties, who forced us not to listen to our body. Right? So a lot of the times as well, again, these supportive measures we want to do may actually end up harming them. So yes, we need to, and of course, again, this is not to blame the parents. They didn't know, right? So this is what I'm saying. We need a whole community, a whole society to make these knowledges available for us. This is a whole community thing. We need to do this together. By the way, that was another hadith that you see how deep it was, that stop eating before you're full. If you just say that to people, it's 100% useless. Because they don't even know when they will be full. It requires 2 months of training to know when you would be full. So again, another hadith that had to be elaborated. Now going back to what we're speaking, so if you don't treat your child as a king, no blame on you, by the way, most parents don't, the grandiosity will go to their unconscious and will keep attacking them. There will be a jealous type, envy, right? Because they'll keep projecting that greatness onto other people, and they want it, they don't have it, they become jealous, all sorts of issues. And if you treat them so much like a king, but then in the next period, you don't bring them down from the throne, because you remember the hadith said, first treat like a king, then a vizier. If you don't bring them down, then they'll go on in the world thinking they're either God's gift to the world, or they're the God gifting to the world, right? And all sorts of issues. And it's very interesting. In this study, he shows everything from obesity, from insomnia, from all sorts of issues that you can think about how they're caused by the same thing. And he talks about this. First of all, if your parents didn't do this for you, how can you later on integrate your grandiosity? Because the important thing for an adult is to have a connection with their inner greatness without identifying from it. Right? If you don't have the greatness, you won't have self-esteem. If you have the greatness and you think the greatness around you, you'll become narcissistic. In Islam, we call that kibr. So, what is the best solution? You teach the child, or later on the adult, how to have access to the greatness so they have energy for life, juice for life, but at the same time, they don't become arrogant by knowing that that greatness is not coming from you. Right? That's kibr. That's, for example, this hadith from the Prophet. Do you see how deep the concept of kibr is? Kibr could be the root of all psychological issues. But the way we talk about it, don't have kibr. And most of us feel like, I don't have kibr, you know? The issue for most of us was kibr. We just didn't know. The idea of how to deal with the greatness inside of us. Have connection to it, because if you don't, you won't have any energy for life. But at the same time, don't identify with it. Know that it's coming from outside of you.
Do you have the name of you mentioned it was Chicago-based, the scientist. Do you have the name of the...
I have some reservations for mentioning their name.
Okay.
So if it's okay, let's...
pretend like you never said any of it.
I'll tell you afterwards, and you can be the judge if it's good to share or not, because I've got some reservations.
That's fine. I think that's... it's fascinating. One thing I've learned from this is that post 8 o'clock, when my daughter can't sleep, I'm dropping her off to your house, because you said it takes a community.
Absolutely.
So you're lending your support in
do you know how they said it took a village
to raise a kid?
That's how it was. Most of us, by us I mean me and my cousins, I should have, in these cases, first of all, our parents were so patient, but also a lot of us were raised by our grandparents. My grandma took a lot of the, burden of our, So again, it's a lot of factors involved. It's not the parents' fault.
But it's like you said, right? Historically, we've you know, especially from ethnic minority backgrounds, we've grown up in villages. And like our grandparents and whatever, and our parents and all of that were, you know, raised, as you say, by the community. But again, I just feel like, you know, in a Western context, in like urban cities, it's just a very different setup.
Absolutely.
So like you said, you know, sometimes you'll have one parent or both parents working till late. You'll have a childminder or a grandparent, whatever. And it's very difficult to, you know, if you were able, if you had all the time in the world, all the money, all the resource in the world, where you could just dedicate both your and your wife or your husband's time to just raising your child, then you could possibly fulfill all of this.
Okay. Is it okay if I jump in?
Yeah, feel free.
Because the thing is, we don't have to be perfect, right? Even if we once we've got the idea of what a perfect parenting would be, then we don't need to implement all of it. None of us can. No one is perfect. That's the whole beauty of being a human being. But we can make some changes. Like if you don't do it, if you can't do it with sleep, there are so many other things you can do, right? First of all, just knowing. This is a whole mental shift. Knowing that your duty in the first few years towards your child is not to, I mean, those are also beautiful, you know, religious upbringing, Sunday schools, all of that. They're beautiful, honestly. But know that the most important thing is your patience with them. And it's not always about sleeping. Sometimes they just, you know, come and pour water on your laptop, or they break your phone, or they just want some of your time. It's not always about sleeping. So just knowing this, that your duty to God with regard to this child is not to go and, for example, do this, or it shows itself here. If you want to make your relationship with God better, it's here. This is where, you know, it takes place. When your child does something that want to make you lose your patience in that moment, right? So this is a shift that everyone can do to some extent. Know that religious upbringing, this is it. Be patient. Also, there are other things. Okay, you can't do it when they're young. You can't treat them as a king. Later on, provide knowledge for them of how to deal with that. Because most of us, we are having those issues and we can't take the time back and tell our parents to. No, most of us are already in the situation. Okay, provide these knowledge for them, right? Talk to them about this. Have, you know what I mean? Like, there are so many things we can do.
I also think, like, on the flip side, the parents may not be listening to this. It might be the kids that are listening to this conversation. And I feel like there's two avenues you can choose at that point, right? Number one is resenting your parents and holding it against them and whatever. Or appreciating their blind spots, or appreciating their shortcomings and trying to fill that gap yourself. And like you said earlier, that's where it comes down to, firstly, self-awareness and knowing the issues within, and then seeking to remedy them. And it's almost like a full circle, because it comes back to the beginning of our conversation, or middle. It's been a long conversation, but when we were talking about, you know, going to scholars and seeking the advice and seeking the remedies, and demanding results almost by saying, give me more, give me more. So look, we've been talking for over an hour now.
Okay.
It's flown by. I know. I'm quite surprised. I look at the time. I can't believe it. I'll leave it up to you. I mean, we can continue talking, or if you think it's, leave the people wanting more, we can always do a part 4 now, another time. Because I think, like, there's, where we started with talking about surrender and where we're at now is a completely different place. But it's been an interesting kind of journey throughout. How do you want to play it?
I want to mention 2 things. One is, first of all, you're an amazing host. So thank you so much for, first of all, inviting me. It's such a great honor for me. You were saying I'm not the creative type. All of that's nonsense. You're amazing. And the way you conduct the interview is perfect.
We're going to have to edit all of this stuff out.
Secondly, I'm so glad you mentioned that maybe the one who's listening is not the parent, is the child. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because exactly, it's very important for us to know that our parents did the best they could. And also that this is now a great opportunity for you to go and figure this out, figure yourself out. And often when I talk to teenagers like this, it's very interesting because, this day and age is the toughest age for teenagers, especially teenage girls. And these are like scientific studies are showing this, right? The amount of depression in teenage girls is crazy. So if you are listening to this, know that maybe this could be your contribution to the world. Maybe now, because you've been through this, if you figure it out, which if you put the energy in, you will, when you figure out how to deal with this, how to get out of it, then you can help so many people who are in the same position as you. And that's amazing. And when sometimes I speak to teenagers like this, you see their eyes light up, you know, from a position in which they think there's no light at the end of the tunnel. Life is, they go, oh, maybe I can get out of this. And that's my purpose. To go and teach other teenagers that this is how to solve this. Or maybe later on I can teach parents how to help their children, you know? So definitely, I'm so glad you brought that up. And with regards to talking more or not, I think we covered quite
a lot of ground.
A lot of ground. So yeah, so thank you so much for having me. And I hope we did manage to make some beneficial points.
Inshallah. No, it's genuinely, I mean, thank you for your kind words earlier, but it's genuinely a pleasure having you on, because I think, you know, when you're speaking at length, which you do on the podcast, my mind is always, no, but it's good because it gives me a lot of time to think, and like I'm trying to, because I don't often listen back to the podcast, so I try to actually experience them in the moment.
So happy.
And have the thoughts whilst it's kind of going on. So it even the last few times we've spoken, it's kind of left me with a lot to kind of just ruminate on and dwell on, because as I said, for me personally, if I just sit here and ask the questions and have a good time and walk away, it's also pointless. So I try to kind of be present, and I'm glad that you talk as long as you do. And I'm not saying this in a like as a subtle attack, but it's because it actually leaves me room to think and dwell on the stuff, and it's fascinating, because I feel like, especially and you've, you know, a few times now in the conversations we've had, you've taken things that I've always overlooked and thought to, and people I think generally think are very simplistic, almost slogans at times. Like I think it was Subhanallah last time, or Alhamdulillah, I can't remember which. I have to go back and listen. But you took something very simple and opened it up to like new dimensions in my own head, and it got me thinking that, you know, there's so much, and you've just done it again with the hadith today, of there's so much that we just fully take for granted. And I think, you know, as a concerted almost community effort, we need to demand more from ourselves,
exactly,
and look at our traditions and really ponder and think and extract the beauty that's within there, because unfortunately, I think the traditions that or how we've received the traditions, it's like drawing water from a stone. But it's not the case. It's like a sponge, a very porous sponge, and you just need to squeeze a little bit and it will come. But we don't see it that way. But no, thank you. I think, you know, it's people's minds are changing, and I'm seeing that with the work, you know, with the Muslim vibe and the conversations that I'm having, that people are starting to look at things. And like you've mentioned, when you talk to young people, it's a different ball game. So inshallah, we can continue this conversation on another podcast.
Inshallah.
If you, I hope I don't have to read like another book to be able to entice you back on.
No, it's always a pleasure to be here, and I really like the TMV audience as well. I had a lot of great messages which showed me that people really take it seriously, and that's so great opportunity for me as well to share my ideas, listen to people's feedback, which I received a lot of feedback as well. That was amazing. And I love how I think you just brought it all back to the first thing of like, you know how you said when you're talking to me or to any other guest, you're trying to be present. That's all the thing we were talked about.
That was unintentional link to surrender.
Surrender, and at the same time, what I was saying of two modes of being in the world. There's one mode in which we says, I already know this, and it has a purpose, right? So a lot of interviewers, the ones especially whose podcasts don't work, they come with an agenda. I want to talk about these things, and that's it, done. Or there is another type, right? Says, okay, let me be present and see what happens, right? Let me not come with a, with an agenda, with a purpose. Let's see what happens. Let's communicate. And it's only in this mode of talking and being that person opens up to you and you see them. Otherwise, you're not seeing them. You're seeing your thoughts. And all I've been saying in this podcast is the same way we can be with religion. You're either trying to, you either treat it as a person you already know, and you end up overlooking it, as you said, these hadiths, in the same way that, unfortunately, a lot of us, we overlook our partners after a while of being with them. They get, there's no more any juice, there's no excitement. Or we can learn another way. Okay, let me see, how can I meet this fresh, right? So the same way that we try to do with people, if we do it with religion, then the beauty of it will show itself to us. And I think I should stop talking. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And this was Javad Shomali signing off.
Thank you very much.